They told us there was no way to stop it. They told us it was inevitable. That word, inevitable, stuck in my head like a splinter. It was the sound of resignation, the kind of word you use when you've already given up before the fight even begins. And yet, here we were, staring at the end of everything we knew, and somehow I couldn't bring myself to believe them. It started 3 days ago. Or maybe it started centuries before, with decisions made by people we never met, mistakes buried so deep in history that no one alive could explain them. Either way, by the time the warning came, the outcome was already calculated. No theories. No debates. Just cold numbers on a screen telling us exactly when the sky would fall. We didn't even see it at first. The thing out there, silent, distant, moving with a patience that felt unnatural, wasn't a comet or an asteroid or anything we had a word for. It didn't burn, didn't shine. It swallowed light. The telescopes picked it up because of what it erased from the stars behind it. The scientists gave it a name, something clinical and forgettable. But for the rest of us, it quickly became known as the shadow. It wasn't just crossing space, it was eating it. And it was headed straight for us. At first, governments tried to keep the news quiet. They failed. You can't hide the kind of fear that seeps into the eyes of people who spend their lives studying the universe. It didn't take long for the truth to leak out, and when it did, chaos followed. Not the loud, screaming kind, at least not yet. This was quieter, stranger. People stopped making plans. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the planet itself knew what was coming. The experts said there was nothing we could do. Every model, every calculation ended the same way: our world swallowed, erased, gone. They spoke of it like it was a storm we couldn't avoid, one we just had to wait for. Some called it fate. Some called it punishment. I called it unacceptable. That's when I found myself in a cold, dimly lit room beneath the old observatory, sitting with people who hadn't given up. Some were scientists. Some were soldiers. Most were just human. Ordinary people who couldn't stand the idea of sitting still and waiting to disappear. We didn't agree on much, not on what the shadow was, not on why it was coming, but we agreed on one thing: we were going to fight. Even if the rest of the planet thought we were insane. The first plan wasn't a plan at all, it was a desperate list of ideas scratched onto a wall in marker. Things we didn't have the technology for. Things that could never be built in time. Things that broke every law of physics we thought we understood. And yet, no one erased a single word. As the hours passed, the world outside kept sliding further into despair. News broadcasts filled with soft-voiced anchors pretending to be calm. Streets went quiet. The sound of construction, traffic, even laughter seemed to fade. And above it all, the shadow kept growing. It didn't move fast, but it never stopped. A dark, perfect arc against the stars, stretching wider every night. I remember standing outside one evening, feeling the cold wind against my face, staring up at it. The human eye wasn't supposed to see something like that, not so far away, not so clearly. But there it was, like a hole in the universe. And for the first time, I wondered if the experts were right. Maybe there really was no stopping it. Then I heard a voice behind me. Do you believe them? It was one of ours, someone from the room under the observatory. She had dark circles under her eyes and a quiet, steady way of speaking. No, I told her. But I think they want us to. That was the difference. It wasn't just the shadow we were fighting, it was the surrender that came with it. The next day we moved to the hangar. It was an abandoned airship facility, long forgotten by anyone who mattered. The floor was cracked, the lights flickered, and half the walls were rusted through. But it was ours, and no one was going to stop us from turning it into something that could matter. There were moments, small ones, where it almost felt like hope. The clatter of tools, the hiss of welding torches, the smell of oil and burned metal. People working together not because they thought they'd win, but because they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't try. We didn't talk much about what would happen if we failed. Failure was just silence. Gone. That was enough to keep us moving. But as the days went on, we started noticing something strange. The shadow wasn't just growing, it was changing. Its shape was shifting, bending in ways that made no sense. The instruments in the observatory started picking up faint pulses, patterns, that almost looked like signals. Signals meant intelligence. That changed everything. If the shadow wasn't just some natural phenomenon, then it wasn't inevitable at all. It was a choice. Someone, or something, was doing this on purpose. And that meant they could be stopped. The realization spread through the group like fire. Our desperation turned into something sharper, more focused. We weren't just trying to save ourselves from a mindless force of nature. We were preparing to stand against a thinking enemy. But it also meant we had to ask a terrifying question. If this thing had crossed the void between stars, if it had been moving toward us for who knows how long, then why now? Why reveal itself now? The answer came sooner than we expected. It was early morning when the alarms went off in the observatory. I was half asleep in a chair when the monitors lit up with motion. The shadow had accelerated. After all those months of creeping closer, it was now moving fast, too fast. At that speed we had hours. Maybe less. The room turned frantic. People shouting, running for equipment, pulling up calculations that no longer mattered. The walls seemed to hum with panic. And yet, in the middle of it all, I felt something cold and steady settle in my chest. The kind of calm you get when the decision is already made. We weren't ready. We didn't have everything we needed. We didn't even know if our plan would work. But if the shadow was coming for us, then it was going to meet something it hadn't planned for. The floor shook. Somewhere far above, the sky roared. The first wave had arrived. And as the lights flickered and the noise built, I realized that inevitable was just a word, one we'd never let define us. We had one chance, one shot to defy the end, and we were about to take it. The roar outside faded into a low, vibrating hum, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Dust drifted down from the ceiling as we looked at each other, trying to decide if we should run or brace for whatever came next. No one moved. It was strange, how in moments like this, seconds seemed to stretch forever. My pulse was pounding so hard it almost drowned out the sound from above. Someone near the back whispered a prayer. Someone else gripped the edge of the table until their knuckles turned white. The first wave, whatever it was, had passed. But that didn't mean we were safe. If anything, it meant the opposite. We didn't know what a wave even meant in the context of the shadow. Was it a weapon? A probe? A warning? All we knew was that the sensors had picked up a sudden spike in energy and then, that sound. "We need eyes on it," someone said. Their voice cracked halfway through the sentence, but the urgency was real. Two of us made our way to the observatory's roof. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of cold that makes it hard to breathe. The sky was darker than it should have been for morning. And there it was, the shadow bigger than ever, blotting out entire constellations. But now, faint against the darkness, there were points of light. Moving. At first I thought they were stars breaking through, but they were too close, too fast. They weren't random either. They were in formation. We ran the footage through the system. The computer tracked the movement, compared the speeds, and spat out a number that made my stomach twist. Those lights were moving at impossible velocities. No human-made craft could match them. "They're here," one of the scientists whispered. It wasn't fear in her voice, it was something worse. Recognition. Back in the hangar, the team gathered around a crude projection of our solar system. The shadow loomed just beyond the outer planets, but those moving lights, they were between us and it now, slipping silently closer. No one wanted to say the obvious, but we were all thinking it. The shadow wasn't some mindless phenomenon. It was a vessel. Maybe a fleet. And those lights? Those were smaller craft sent ahead. If they were scouts, that meant they already knew about us. I wanted to ask why they hadn't struck yet. Why not end it quickly? But then I remembered the way the shadow had slowed in the past, the way it had lingered just far enough away for us to notice. It wasn't in a hurry because it didn't have to be. It wanted us to see it coming. We went over every scrap of data we had. The pulses, the shifting shape, the sudden acceleration. None of it made sense unless we assumed intelligence and intent. And once you assume intent, you have to ask, what does it want? One of the engineers, an older man who had been mostly silent until now, finally spoke up. "This isn't an attack," he said. "Not yet. This is pressure. They want us to break ourselves before they even get here." It was a chilling thought, but it explained too much to ignore. Maybe they were watching to see how we'd react, whether we'd surrender, fight, or destroy ourselves trying. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the hangar, past the half-finished structures and scattered tools. The smell of grease and metal was sharp in the air. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of how far we had to go and how little time we had left. I stopped at one of the unfinished frames, what might one day be a ship. My hand rested on the cold steel. I thought about the people here, the ones who had left everything behind to fight for something we might never see. Most of them weren't scientists or soldiers. They were mechanics, farmers, teachers, students. People who had no reason to be here except that they couldn't live with the thought of doing nothing. That, more than anything else, was what made us dangerous. In the morning, the scouts were closer. The sensors picked up faint transmissions, but they weren't in any language we knew. They weren't even in sound. They were patterns, bursts of radiation, precisely timed. Someone asked if they could be a warning. Someone else said maybe they were trying to talk. But the truth was we didn't know. We didn't know if they wanted us to respond or if a response would mark us as a threat. The tension was grinding everyone down. Arguments started over nothing. Over the placement of a beam, over who got to use the communications equipment. We were united in purpose, but that didn't mean we weren't human. Fear eats away at unity faster than anything else. Still, the work continued. We scavenged parts from anything we could find. Old satellites, derelict stations, even stripped-down airliners. Some of it barely functioned, but it was better than nothing. And all the while, the shadow loomed larger. There was one moment I can't forget. Late in the day, the sun dipped low, and for a second, the shadow's edge caught the light. It wasn't smooth. It was jagged, like the surface of some massive ancient machine. And in that light, I could almost see movement along it. Tiny flashes like windows or ports. It wasn't just a ship. It was something far older and stranger than we could imagine. I didn't tell the others what I saw. Not yet. We needed focus, not more fear. But the image stayed with me, and with it came a thought I couldn't shake. If this thing had been traveling toward us for so long, maybe it had passed other worlds. And if it had, then somewhere out there might already be ruins left in its wake. That night, I dreamed of cities under alien skies, torn apart and silent. When I woke, the air in the hangar felt different, heavier. I stepped outside, and for the first time I heard it. A deep, low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You didn't hear it with your ears so much as feel it in your bones. Others came outside one by one, staring at the sky. No one spoke. We didn't need to. Whatever that sound was, it meant the shadow wasn't just watching anymore. It was reaching for us. And we still didn't know why. The vibration didn't stop. It became the background to everything, working, eating, even trying to sleep. No one could escape it. It was like the shadow had found a way to get inside our bones, into our thoughts. By the second day, the scouts were close enough to see without instruments. Pinpricks of light against the dark, moving in a slow, deliberate arc. They weren't just coming straight for us. They were circling, watching from every angle. We shut down all unnecessary transmissions. Whatever they were doing, we weren't going to give them any more information than we had to. But deep down, we knew they probably already knew everything. The work in the hangar became frantic. Sparks flew from welding torches late into the night, and the clatter of tools never stopped. Sleep was a luxury no one could afford anymore. People moved like they were on the edge of collapse, but no one walked away. I kept catching myself staring at the unfinished ships. They were crude, untested, nothing like the sleek designs we had once imagined humanity might build for the stars. These were desperate machines put together from scraps and hope. And yet, looking at them, I felt something hard in my chest, because they were ours. On the third night, the vibration deepened. It felt heavier, slower, like a pulse. The scouts stopped moving in arcs and formed a perfect line, all facing Earth. We didn't need sensors to know they were focusing on us. We could feel it. The older engineer, the one who had called this pressure, stood at the center of the hangar floor staring at the projection. "They're giving us a choice," he said quietly. "What kind of choice?" someone asked. He didn't answer. The pulses grew stronger. You could see drinks trembling in cups, dust lifting from the rafters. And then, in the middle of the night, a burst of light filled the sky. It wasn't an explosion, it was too clean, too precise. It hung there like a shimmering curtain, rippling across the horizon. No one knew what it meant. But every instrument we had spiked at once. Radiation, magnetic shifts, things no one could explain. It wasn't until an hour later that we realized the signal had changed. The pattern was new. Faster. Urgent. Someone translated the timing into sound. It wasn't words, but it was deliberate, like a coded knock on a locked door. We didn't know if it was an invitation, or a warning. Every instinct told me this was it. This was the moment. If we answered wrong, there would be no time to recover. The debate split the room. Some said we should respond, show we weren't afraid. Others said silence was our only defense. The arguing turned loud, voices overlapping until it was impossible to hear any one of them clearly. That's when the power went out. The hangar was swallowed in darkness. Only the faint red glow of the emergency lights remained. And then, the vibration stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had ever been. We ran to the observatory. The scouts were gone. Completely gone. No readings, no heat signatures, nothing. But the shadow was closer. Much closer. So close now that you could see its edges moving, like vast structures turning in slow motion. It was no longer just a dark shape in the sky. It was a wall, stretching from horizon to horizon, and it was coming down on us. Alarms blared as the system calculated distance. Hours. We had hours left. Back in the hangar, people moved with a speed I'd never seen before. Voices barked orders, hands tightened bolts, engines coughed and sputtered. Every unfinished line of code was typed in fury, every missing panel bolted down with whatever we could find. Outside, the sky dimmed, not from clouds but from the sheer mass above us. It was like standing in the shadow of a mountain that could move. I caught sight of the older engineer again. He was at one of the ships, running his hand along its side like he was memorizing it. When he noticed me watching, he said, "If this works, it'll be because we did it together. If it doesn't," he didn't finish. He didn't have to. The pulses returned, but this time they weren't from the scouts. They came from the shadow itself. Louder. Sharper. Like a heartbeat shaking the planet. Every part of me wanted to cover my ears, but there was nowhere to hide from it. The sound was inside everything. Inside me. Then came the light. Blinding white, pouring down in columns across the atmosphere. The air felt electric, alive, as if the whole planet was caught in the grip of something vast and unseen. We didn't know if this was the beginning of an attack or the start of something else entirely. But one thing was certain, whatever happened next would decide everything. Engines roared in the hangar as the first of the ships powered up. The floor trembled beneath my feet, and the smell of burning fuel filled the air. The shadow's heartbeat grew faster. The older engineer shouted something over the noise, but I couldn't hear it. All I could hear was the deep, rising hum from above, and all I could see was the vast darkness pressing closer, filling the sky. And then, everything began to shake. The shaking didn't stop. It wasn't like an earthquake. It was smoother, more controlled, as if the planet itself was being moved. The sound from above deepened again, and the columns of white light narrowed, tightening into beams that swept slowly across the surface. Someone shouted from the observatory that the beams weren't random. They were searching. Mapping. I thought they were looking for us, but then a second set of readings came in, and everything we thought we knew fell apart. The beams weren't aimed at us at all. They were focused far beyond, past the horizon, targeting points deep in the ocean. At first no one understood. Then the sonar readings lit up. Shapes. Massive shapes, rising from the deep. They weren't ours. The hangar went silent, except for the thrum of the engines we just brought to life. All eyes were on the display as those shapes surfaced. Hundreds of them, too large to be any known submarine, moving in coordinated formations. It hit me then, whatever was down there had been here long before the shadow arrived. The older engineer muttered something under his breath. "They're not here for us, they're here for them." But that didn't make it better. It made it worse. Because if the shadow had crossed the stars to hunt something hiding on our own planet, then we'd been living with it all along, without knowing. And if those things had stayed hidden this long, it wasn't because they were harmless. The ocean erupted on the horizon. Towering columns of water shot into the air as the shapes broke the surface. Even from this far away you could see they were alive, or at least they moved like living things. Their surfaces shimmered with unnatural patterns, reflecting the white beams like mirrors. They didn't run from the shadow. They moved toward it. Every sensor went wild. Electromagnetic spikes. Radiation bursts. Frequencies we couldn't even interpret. The realization hit like a punch. We weren't in the middle of an invasion. We were in the middle of a war. And we didn't know which side, if either, wanted us alive when it was over. One of the ships in the hangar sputtered and died. The crew inside cursed and tore panels open, hands moving in a blur. We didn't have time for breakdowns. Outside, the beams intensified, locking onto the rising shapes. The shadow shifted, massive sections opening like the petals of some mechanical flower. From the gaps came smaller objects, too big to be scouts, too fast to be part of the main structure. We'd thought the first lights were the enemy's front line. We'd been wrong. Those had been observers. This was an army. The older engineer grabbed my arm, his voice low but urgent. "If those ocean things win, they'll take the planet for themselves. If the shadow wins, there won't be a planet left to take." There was no safe side. No ally. Only two predators, and we were caught in the middle. The ground trembled again as the first strikes hit the ocean. The shockwaves carried through the earth, rattling the hangar walls. Outside, the horizon flashed over and over, each blast brighter than the last. Someone in the control room yelled that the ocean shapes had begun transmitting. Their signals weren't like the shadows, they were harsher, more chaotic. But they were definitely aimed at the surface, at us. We scrambled to decode them, even though part of me didn't want to know. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was a claim. But deep down, I feared it was an invitation, to choose a side in a war we didn't start. In the chaos, the older engineer made the call. Launch what we have. Now. Before either side decides for us. Engines roared back to life. Doors screeched open. The first of our ships lifted from the floor, its rough, welded frame shaking under the strain. It wasn't ready. None of them were. But the sky was already full of fire, and the sea was boiling with shapes older than our history. We had seconds before the first blast reached us. The beams were sweeping closer. Somewhere inside me the fear cracked, and what replaced it wasn't relief. It was something harder. We'd been told the end was inevitable. Then we learned it wasn't. Now we knew it was worse than that, because the end might not even come from the enemy we'd prepared for. The shadows' forces descended. The ocean shapes surged upward. And above the chaos, our unfinished ships clawed their way into the air. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. We were no longer fighting to defy the inevitable. We were fighting to survive the impossible. The first blast hit before our ships cleared the atmosphere. It wasn't aimed at us, but the force rattled every bolt and seam, making the metal groan like it was alive. Through the viewport, I saw the ocean tearing itself apart, columns of water collapsing into boiling craters where the beams struck. The massive shapes that had risen from the deep twisted and rolled in the chaos, their mirrored surfaces splintering into shards of light. We climbed higher and the view widened. The shadow's forces poured from its open sections in numbers I couldn't count, each one moving with precise, silent coordination. They didn't waste energy. Every strike hit with surgical precision, each blast forcing the ocean creatures into tighter clusters. But the creatures fought back. They launched arcs of burning light that cut through the black sky, tearing into the smaller shadow craft. Some of the beams missed, slicing across the clouds and leaving trails of vapor glowing in the dim air. We didn't fire. Not yet. We didn't even know who to fire at. The radio crackled with half-shouted updates from the other ships. One was already limping, its left wing scorched by a passing blast. Another had lost navigation completely and was spinning to regain control. But none of them turned back. We were committed. The older engineer's voice came through the comm, steady despite the noise. We find the source. Take it out, no matter which side it belongs to. It was a gamble. If we took out the wrong one, we could be dooming ourselves. But there wasn't time to hesitate. We threaded through the chaos, skimming past flashes of light and debris. The shadow loomed ahead, impossibly massive. Up close, the jagged edges weren't random, they were structures. Towers, domes, and ridges that looked grown as much as built. The whole thing pulsed faintly, like the beat of a distant heart. And then we saw it. A core, buried deep in the center, glowing with a cold blue light that made my stomach turn. Every pulse from the shadow's fleet matched the rhythm of that glow. It was the brain, the command point. Before we could adjust course, a beam from the ocean creatures cut across our path. It wasn't aimed at us, it was aimed at the same core. That was when I understood. They weren't fighting for the planet. They were both trying to destroy each other's core before one could gain full control. Earth was just where the battlefield happened to be. The creature's strike hit, but the shadow's defenses flared, absorbing the blast in a web of energy. And then every smaller craft turned toward us. We'd been noticed. The engineer's voice was sharp now. All ships on me. Hit it together. We dove. Every alarm in the cockpit screamed as the hull heated and shook. The shadow's defenses opened fire, not beams this time, but bursts of some invisible force that sent our ships spinning. One of ours took a direct hit, splitting apart in a silent flash that left nothing but drifting fragments. I gritted my teeth and pushed forward. The core swelled larger in the viewport, that cold blue light burning against the black. We lined up the shot. The older engineer's voice came one last time. Now. Every ship fired. The light flared, then collapsed inward, sucking the surrounding structures into itself in a storm of twisting metal and shattered beams. The shadow convulsed, massive sections breaking apart like ice under strain. Its smaller craft faltered, their movements erratic. The ocean creatures surged forward, beams lancing into the wounded structure. In seconds, the shadow began to fall apart. We didn't stay to watch. The shockwave from its collapse slammed into us, throwing the ships into uncontrolled spins. I fought the controls, barely keeping us level as the pieces of the once massive structure tumbled through the sky and into the sea. When the light faded, the shadow was gone. But the ocean creatures weren't. They rose higher, breaking the surface completely for the first time. Up close, they were monstrous and beautiful, vast, shimmering forms that seemed to shift between metal and flesh. They didn't attack us. They just hovered watching. Then, as one, they began to descend back into the water. The radio was full of static and stunned voices. We'd done it. We'd stopped the shadow. We'd survived. For a moment I almost believed it, until the sonar readings changed. From deep below, far deeper than any of the shapes had risen from before, something else was moving. Larger than the shadow. Larger than anything. The ocean creatures didn't seem to notice, or maybe they did and that's why they were retreating. The older engineer's voice came through, quieter than before. That wasn't the enemy, he said. That was the scout. The water on the horizon began to bulge upward, higher and higher, like the surface of the planet itself was breathing. And I realized we hadn't defied the inevitable. We'd only delayed it. The smoke had thinned, but the air still carried the bitter tang of ash. I stood there, staring at the ground where so much had happened, my hands trembling though the danger was over. The silence was strange now, almost unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. For a moment I wondered if this was what peace felt like, or if it was just the quiet before something else broke. We had done it. We had faced what everyone said was impossible and somehow we had stood our ground. The inevitability they spoke of, the future we were told couldn't be changed, had shattered. I could feel the weight of that truth pressing down on me, heavier than fear, heavier than the fight itself. Because now there were no more excuses. If we could change this, we could change anything. And that meant there was no going back to the way things were. The others gathered slowly, faces tired but eyes burning with the same realization. We were still alive. Not all of us, but enough to matter. Enough to remember. The youngest among us, covered in grime and with a cut running across his cheek, whispered, "So, what now?" His voice cracked in the quiet, like a sound not sure if it belonged here. I looked at him, at all of them, and felt the question sink into me. What now? The fight had defined us for so long that the thought of living without it felt foreign. The truth was, none of us knew how to go back to being normal, if normal even existed anymore. Someone found an old bench half buried in rubble, and we sat together, not talking much at first. It wasn't because there was nothing to say but because there was too much. Words felt too small for everything we had seen. But slowly the conversations began. Quiet, hesitant at first, then growing. We talked about the ones we'd lost, the moments we thought it was over, and the strange flashes of hope that kept us going when nothing else made sense. I thought about the people who had warned us, the ones who said fighting back was pointless. I wished they could see us now, not for revenge, not for pride, but because maybe they'd believe in themselves a little more. Maybe they'd understand that inevitability is just a story someone tells you to keep you still. Night fell slowly as if the day was reluctant to end. The sky turned deep orange, then dark purple, and the stars came out one by one. I leaned back, staring up at them. For the first time in a long while, they didn't feel distant. They felt close, like they were watching, waiting to see what we'd do next. Around the fire we started making plans. Not grand, world-changing plans, not yet. Small ones. Find the rest of the survivors. Rebuild what we could. Keep telling the truth about what had happened so no one could twist it later. Each idea was like a thread, and slowly, those threads began to weave something new, a future that wasn't decided yet. Before I could speak my own thoughts, someone asked, "Do you think it's really over?" I paused, letting the question hang there. The fire cracked, sending up a thin trail of sparks into the night. I think, I said slowly, that nothing's ever really over. But I think we've changed the ending they wanted for us. That's enough for now. We all sat there watching the flames, each of us carrying our own memories of the fight. Some of those memories would never fade. Some would hurt for the rest of our lives. But they were ours. And in a strange way they were proof that we had lived, that we had mattered. When the fire burned low, I walked to the edge of the clearing and looked out over the land. The ruins were still there, jagged and broken, but the shadows no longer seemed to hide something waiting to strike. In the distance I thought I saw movement, maybe just the wind, maybe not. A reminder that there would always be something unknown ahead. I turned back toward the group, feeling something inside me settle. The world wasn't perfect. It never had been. But it was ours again. We had defied the inevitable, and in doing so, we had proven that the impossible was only impossible until someone refused to believe it. That night, I slept without fear for the first time in years. The air was still cold, the ground still hard, but my dreams were different. I dreamed of the day we'd tell the next generation what happened. Not as a warning but as a promise. A promise that no matter what came, there would always be those who stood up and said, "Not this time." And maybe that was the real victory. Not just surviving but showing that we could write our own ending. That even when the world told us the story was already over, we could pick up the pen and change it. When I woke at dawn, the light was soft and golden, touching the edges of the rubble like it was something worth keeping. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, it didn't taste like smoke or fear. It tasted like a beginning. We started walking that morning, not away from the fight but toward whatever came next. Together. Because we knew now that as long as we stood side by side, there was no such thing as inevitable. Only the stories we hadn't written yet. And somewhere deep down I hoped the world was listening.